Well, welcome everybody to this educational research seminar. It's an absolute pleasure to be able to introduce Jess today, who is an AHRC funded PhD student who is working jointly with us in EdRes and Sociology. And Jess is just about to finish her PhD and has done some absolutely fabulous work, which you'll hear about today. So it's a real pleasure that she's speaking in this seminar. So the format is, as you may know, that Jess will speak for around 45 minutes, and then there'll be plenty of time for questions. So you can ask questions at the end by raising your hand and speaking them, or you can put questions in the chat as we go along or at the end. The session is being recorded and will be available online afterwards on the department's website. We ask that during the presentation that everybody turns off their cameras and their microphones, and I'll do that myself in a minute so that just only Jess is visible during the presentation and for the recording. I think that's probably everything. So if everybody makes sure their cameras are off and that they are muted, and then I'll hand over to Jess. And Jess, thank you.
Thanks, Carolyn. Great. Hi, everyone. Can I just check you can hear me? I just got muted and then unmuted. I'm not sure if that's because I'm not coming through.
No, sorry, that was me. I was trying to mute myself. Apologies.
Okay, no problem. Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for having me. It's great to be here as much as I am anywhere right now. So my name's Jessica Wren Butler, and as Carolyn said, I'm a doctoral researcher here at Lancaster. I'm just finishing up my PhD project, and that's about unequal experiences of belonging in English higher education. I've also worked in university professional services since 2007, and my most recent role involves managing an institutional submission to the Research Excellence Framework, aka the REF, at a small specialist institution after doing some similar work at a large Russell Group university. So these two areas of experience are really what I'm drawing on in this presentation today. Why is that not working? So today I'll be talking about some of the implications of the REF for equality, diversity, and inclusion in English academia. I'll begin with an overview of the wider research project that generated the empirical data I'm drawing on. Then I'll provide a short explainer of the REF basics and why it's so important to institutions, before moving to discuss how this can affect academic staff. The consequences of the REF, I'll argue, have generally negative impacts that are rendered all the more problematic for being unequally distributed. In other words, some parts of the HE sector and some individuals and groups within the sector can be disproportionately disadvantaged by the institutional policies and practices brought in to satisfy REF requirements or to allay REF fears. Furthermore, as well as being an issue for those currently affected, the direction of travel represented by these policies and practices is one that further entrenches inequalities in who can sustain an academic career. I should also issue a disclaimer at this point, though, that this presentation is entirely drawn from interview data and my own experience, so it's quite light on references to other people's work. But I'm by no means the only person making these kinds of arguments. And since publication of the REF results a couple of weeks ago, a lot more attention has been focused on these matters, much of which I haven't had an opportunity to engage with yet. So what I present here is indicative rather than exhaustive. So this research project began because I was interested in the prevailing culture of academia in England during the current period of transition from the exclusive ivory tower of a few decades ago to the so-called neoliberal academy of recent years. There seemed to be a lot of pearl clutching about change in HE, as if somehow the very fibre of it was being unravelled, while at the same time, none of the neoliberal innovations being brought in seemed particularly different, at least in spirit, to the way things had been done previously. In other words, the values underpinning the practice of academia have remained much the same. This means there's a tension between the expansion of HE, which has necessarily meant a more diverse student and staff body, and the fundamentally exclusive, competitive, and hierarchical nature of the university, the norms of which were set by a very narrow group of people, i.e. white men of the relative elite. Working and studying in universities taught me that there are established ways that academia is meant to be done, and certain criteria that must be met in order to succeed in the many competitive practices of HE. Considering that this environment was for so long exclusively populated by a certain demographic, led me to wondering whether there are particular kinds of people who are more adapted to the established ways and thus have a competitive advantage, and how this might impact those who don't want to, can't, or are not seen to be able to match these modes of operation. Is there such a thing as an ideal academic? And if so, how might understanding its features aid efforts to increase equality, diversity, and inclusion in HE? To explore this further, I interviewed 29 current or recent academics working in English higher education institutions, or HEIs, compiling a sample to represent a broad range of perspectives. Participants were asked about their experiences of being an academic, conceptions of success and failure, the relationship between personal and professional identity, and what changes they had observed in HE during their career. The resulting data suggested not only that there are some fairly stable characteristics associated with the image of a successful academic, but the participants themselves often had a figure in their mind already as a point of comparison. Most often this was referred to as the proper academic, and it operated both as an abstract fantasy and one that was realized through certain individuals who were seen to represent proper academicness. Perhaps the most notable feature of the proper academic is that it was consistently something other people were, even though participants frequently observed that to outside eyes, they too would appear successful. Some features of the proper academic were clear and obvious, such as having lots of publications and research grants, while some took more work to identify. And there are, of course, divergences in norms and ideals across the academy. However, I'm primarily interested in the common overarching ideas about academia and academics, especially where these show us something about how different kinds of academic practice are valued. For example, the stereotype of the lone scholar sitting in a fancy library with a pile of dusty books privileges a particular way of doing academia only available to some disciplines, not to mention a certain kind of person who may be more readily associated with this kind of labor. What became clearer the more I engaged with the data was that the proper academic is above all someone who is perceived to fit in, someone who appears to unquestionably belong in academia and who is duly furnished with the rewards of being an insider. This is somewhat cyclical though, as gaining academic success is both an indicator of and route to belonging, and perceived belonging is a marker of success. However, it often seemed that it wasn't so much the successes themselves that participants craved, and many were critical of the measures used to determine success and thus ambivalent about what it would mean to achieve it, but rather the sense of security and inclusion that they imagined would come with being, or being seen as, more proper. Understanding this relationship between belonging, outward success, and properness provided a way into isolating some of the subtler features of the ideal academic, which were most visible in the data when a sense of unbelonging was expressed by participants. Unbelonging I define as a sense of being out of place, or a disjunction between the individual and the environment, a sort of disconnection, dislocation. The final list of proper academic characteristics I then divided into three broad categories that I've called legibility zones, by which I mean areas in which individuals are made intelligible, recognizable, and visible as proper academics, both to themselves and others. So legibility zone 1 corresponds to everything administrative and bureaucratic, all of the institutional machinery and labor one engages with in the course of holding an academic job. In other words, the things academics are meant to do. Zone 2 is about beliefs and values, the philosophical constitution of an academic and the commonly held stereotypes of what academics are meant to be. Zone 3 relates to embodied characteristics and presentation, or how academics are meant to appear. The areas or themes of academic life associated with each zone are on the slide now, just the ones that came up in the data. Obviously, it's not fully exhaustive. What I hope the legibility zones framework offers is a way of thinking about the complex interplay between different aspects of identity, from social roles to beliefs to corporeality, highlighting how properness in one area can be used to offset marginality in another, how we move through states of belonging and unbelonging depending on our context, and how the ways others read us, based on partial information, or in some cases, excellent PR, rarely matches our internal experience. Everyone can probably relate to both feeling a sense of unbelonging and assessing the belongingness of others, but some will experience this more often and in more areas at once, meaning the psychological and material impacts of unbelonging are unequally distributed. Now, one of the strongest ideological positions occupied by participants was the belief in education for education's sake, manifesting in a fierce antipathy towards the incursion of economic considerations into academia. As participant 22 put it, their wish is to, quote, somehow magically insulate the lovely world of ideas and care that is my fluffy dream university from the nasty, savage, dirty, money-grabbing world of finance and management, end quote. Thus, the ref, as an exercise of enormous institutional, financial, and thus managerial significance, is frequently maligned by academics for epitomizing the collision of the world of ideas into the nasty, savage, dirty world of money. Now, personally, I'm pragmatic about the financialization of higher education, and that I think the ship has sailed. And one of its positive correlations has been the expansion and thus diversification of academia. I'm also not averse to accountability or the principle of measurement and audit to, I don't know, for example, help students decide where to study and monitor their provision, or to ensure the responsible use of public funds. However, the apparatuses deployed to enact these processes vary in their effects, and the ref is an excellent example of an accountability exercise that, in practice, if not by design, brings with it many issues. So in a sense, the ref is a sort of research pageant, and it has increasingly heavy influence over research in UK HE. First introduced in 2014 to replace the research assessment exercise, and repeated in 2021, the ref is intended to be an audit of the quality of research produced by HEIs, with results determining what proportion of the quality-related funding pot the institution is granted. As well as allocating funding, ref results allow for league tables to be produced across a range of metrics, so there is a competitive element for prestige and reputation too. Each iteration of the ref evolves to bring slightly different requirements, which in turn produce different effects. The basic principle, however, is that universities make a submission to each unit of assessment or subject area represented at the institution. Submissions comprise a number of research outputs published during a defined 7-year period and proportional to the FTE of eligible staff employed on a particular date, averaging 2.5 per full-time staff member for a minimum of 1 and maximum of 5 per individual. These outputs are accompanied by impact case studies detailing the positive effect of individual research projects or clusters of research, a narrative statement describing the research environment in that subject area, and data about research students and income. Each submission is assessed by an expert panel and a scoring profile awarded based on a matrix running from unclassified to 4-star, using the criteria originality, significance, and rigor for outputs, and reach and significance for impact. Funding is allocated depending on the proportion of the submission in the 3-star and 4-star range. Consequently, this comes to be how research is talked about institutionally. As participant 21 says, quote, now it's stated in ref terms that, we want to see this many 3-star and this many 4-star and whatever. So putting aside for a moment the question of whether the assessment criteria are what we might consider the most crucial features of research to judge, it should be noted that many of the assumptions, fears, and understandings that circulate about how the ref works are not strictly true. The rules, for the most part, make allowance for institutions to compile a submission in a fair way, and many of the issues stemming from the ref are not baked into it. However, in practice, there's considerable scope for harmful policies and processes to be enacted by institutions in their risk-averse scramble to win the most funding. Furthermore, there were in 2021 over 300 pages of guidance. So even at its simplest, the compilation of a submission is a complicated and burdensome endeavour. This increases the chances of poor or ill thought through decisions being made without the time and space for consequences to be considered. In other words, even if the ref per se is not as nefarious as many in HE would have you believe, myths and perceptions pervade and have a significant impact on how the ref is viewed and conducted. The ref is of vital importance to HEIs because of the amount of funding at stake. For most academics, though, the immediate significance of the ref relates primarily to the amount of stress, anxiety, and potential for unbelonging institutional ref processes and timelines create. In order to fully understand, lost my place. Oh, there we go, sorry. In order to fully understand the sway the ref holds, it's necessary to note two key themes of the project. The privileging of research over other forms of academic labour as the most proper academic activity, and the strong commitment to the idea that a proper academic doesn't just do academic work, but is an academic through and through. In other words, academia is a vocation, a calling, and never just a job. This increases the personal and emotional impact of professional insecurities, particularly as related to research, many of which are created or exacerbated by ref-related decisions and processes. Research, as one of the more measured and externally visible forms of academic labour, holds a particular prestige in comparison to other activities. Accruing grants and outputs is a key route to academic success, both internally and externally. It keeps institutions happy, and it augments the CV to make individuals more competitive in the academic marketplace. Conversely, failing to garner a sufficient number of highly regarded publications and adequate grant capture, which also means there's less to contribute to the ref submission, breeds a sense of unbelonging and has real consequences for career progression. It should be noted that not all academic roles come with an expectation of research activity, and there were participants in the sample who were teaching focused. However, it was widely reported, including by those people, that a so-called standard academic contract encompassing both teaching and research was the holy grail of academic roles. Several participants used that exact language to talk about a permanent standard academic contract. Therefore, although research was for most participants the part of the job they most valued and in which they got to fully embody their vocation, it also produced considerable anxiety about productivity and quality. Furthermore, because research tends to have fewer deadline-based requirements and doesn't take human form in the same way as a student knocking on the door or sending an email, it tended to be the first task to fall off the agenda in a squashed work week. Its considerable importance, though, means it can't be suspended indefinitely. And this led to research work being done largely in evenings and weekends, either to meet basic requirements, including having sufficient ref contributions, or to outstrip one's peers. Demonstrating appropriate commitment to the vocation through excessive working in this very kind of performative way is also a key feature of the proper academic. Most immediate problem with this, of course, is that not everyone is equally able to meet this threshold of overwork, and nor does everyone want to, but there's little room for falling short. The ability to gain tokens of validation, and thus the tokens themselves, are not evenly distributed. With research occupying such a pivotal position, this is a significant barrier to a more inclusive HE, and the added institutional pressure of the ref incentivizes individualistic behavior that can result in others being saddled with the less rewarded labor. As participant 8 observes, quote, "You need to protect your research time because that's what the system, performance management, tells you to do. So it trains staff to effectively learn to be helpless in other areas deliberately. So you can say, oh, I don't know anything about this. So you do a shit job deliberately so you can get on with some research." Although the ref grading system is rather narrow and specific, as are its definitions of research and impact, the significance of the exercise inevitably means its criteria become a major standard by which research is valued, and there's a strong incentive to play things safe. Rather than researchers exploring topics purely of interest and publishing their results wherever seems most suitable, then, These choices become increasingly considered in ref terms, whether at individual or institutional levels. HEIs can wield gatekeeping powers, determining what kinds of research they'll support, and anticipated ref performance is one measure by which these decisions can be made. Thus, although the ref might be branded as an audit, a simple litmus test of what is already being done, in practicality, this is very far from the truth. It reorientates priorities and requires a considerable amount of work to collate the work done in a 7-year period, then select, create, and input the submission. Several components must be written entirely from scratch, and even some types of research outputs, practice-based ones, for example, are still not finished once they're released into the public domain, as they require repackaging to make the research content intelligible. The ref submission requires a lot more than simply gathering up pre-existing content. Determining which outputs are the best is an exercise in itself, the best, with most institutions conducting internal and external peer review. This can be both a drain on time for reviewers who are drawn from other universities mostly and doing their own ref submissions, and an anxiety-laced experience for those subject to judgment by their peers. There's also particular worry around those members of staff who have, for whatever reason, not been able to produce their minimum of 1 output, or who've not produced enough outputs perceived to be 3-star or 4-star, which exacerbates precarity and places the spotlight on individuals. In short, there are a lot of problems with the way the ref pays out in institutions, from the heavy load of compiling and entering a submission, to the consequences of strategies implemented to maximize results, to the individual impacts of ref-related scrutiny, to the wider changes in research culture created by the skewing of orientation towards ref success. One complication of deciding a ref strategy is that the effects are so long-term. If kinder processes in the short term lead to less funding, that results in difficult decisions further down the line. Furthermore, even if the ref is executed with noble intent, inevitably it takes priority from other activities, especially if they don't have equivalent audits ensuring they're given similar attention. As participant 8 points out, research-active academics are indoctrinated into this ref-forward mindset from an early stage and encouraged to prioritize some tasks over others. Quote, "You get your training and it's basically ref, ref, ref. Fuck teaching, because teaching does nothing for your career." As well as this focus on research to the detriment of other academic labour, the spectre of the ref influences what kinds of research are considered worth spending time on. Participant 13 left academia for partly this reason. Quote, "I felt like I was moving away from what they wanted me to do. Well, I was kind of being told that basically, oh, I don't know if this will be refable, and, you know, just because of not because of where it was, but because of the discipline, as it were." This is not an isolated case, as indicated by participant 14's observation that, quote, "People being pushed out of academia who were there because they weren't refable enough, like that brutality has been really ramped up." It's worth noting here that the term refable is a neologism that has taken firm root in UK academia. It should also be clarified that, contrary to my initial assumption, it usually doesn't mean eligible for submission to the ref. It in fact usually means likely to score 3-star or 4-star, i.e. attracting funding. This effectively renders all research that doesn't meet a standard of international excellence worthless, because its value is conflated with its ability to attract ref funding. Participant 12 expands, quote, "One of the real pernicious malign changes that happened, which doesn't get commented on enough, was to do with Ref 2014 and how, so previously it was all about, rating research 1 to 4 or unclassified to 4. Okay. But then a decision was made that only some research would draw down funding. Research that was seen to be over 2-star. I think that's a terrible thing to happen, because what it means is unthought through. What it means is research which we are saying is nationally important. Think of that, nationally important. That sounds quite good. Or internationally, what's the phrase? Internationally recognized. Great, but it's not good enough. You think, what? It makes a nonsense of what we're doing. So we have to pretend that all our research is internationally significant or world leading. And if it isn't, if we can't pretend that, it's somehow not good enough. This is a fiendishly high bar, especially for those at the start of their career. And it takes on a particular significance at certain times, compounding inequalities. In Ref 2021, HEIs had to submit at least one output by everyone on an eligible contract on the census date, in this case, 31st of July 2020. This has a knock-on effect to hiring practices in the year or so prior, where because of the length of research and publication processes, time is too short to appoint research roles to those without sufficient outputs already published. As participant 12 says, quote, you get into these weird situations where people sort of shortly out of their PhDs are expected, if they want to get a job, are expected to be doing research from their PhDs, which is supposed to be 3 and 4 star. It should be noted that there are ways around this, as allowed for in the REF guidance, which has mechanisms for applying to reduce the number of outputs required, including removing the minimum of 1 per person. This is based on personal circumstances, one of which is being very early career. However, especially at larger institutions, this is the kind of detail department level staff often aren't aware of. It adds an amount of administration and uncertainty that it's easier not to engage with. And it's also up to staff to self-disclose any mitigating circumstances. And that sort of places them in a conflict of interest, really, because not everyone wants to disclose that, but you know, being seen to harm the REF submission is also penalised. Here, as in many places, bad decisions are made at least in part because they're simply the path of least resistance or complication. When everyone is stretched for time and bandwidth, it's easy to shy away from anything that creates more work or more risk. The pressure to publish, and to publish well, is also an issue for existing staff. Returning staff to the REF without refable publications is not a risk most institutions are willing to take, a problem to which various creative solutions have sprung up, usually involving contractual redefinition, such that staff in question become ineligible for REF submission, stripped of research responsibility, made redundant, or perhaps just ushered towards the door. Participant 29 was in this position, quote, I'm getting my butt kicked a little bit, metaphorically, to make sure that I publish and publish really, really soon, because otherwise it's going to be too late for me to be put forward. If that's not forthcoming, if publications are not forthcoming from me, then I think I'd be in a very precarious situation. Not only is the insecurity presented by these questions of whether a person has produced enough publications and whether they'll be deemed good enough, an existential one in terms of career continuation, it's a manifestation of more subtle forms of exclusion too, whether being sidelined into teaching only responsibilities or, in Ref 2014, when not all staff had to be returned, omitted from the submission entirely. I wasn't included in the Ref last time, says participant 28. I was furious. I really felt excluded from the group. This experience in 2014 motivated certain behaviour changes for the following Ref period. They say, I couldn't believe it. I'd done enough outputs, I thought, and I'd done them with what I thought were proper institutions and proper, academics and so on. And then after that, I just thought, right, I'm going to blitz it. I'm not going to be excluded again. So I'm going to hit journals, particularly rather than edited collections, which is what I'd done before, and try and get a range of outputs. Now, whether this type of mindset shift was an intention of the Ref or an unforeseen consequence is up for debate. Many would perhaps agree with participant 25 that, quote, it's supposed to be an audit, but has become a driving benchmark, a decision-driving benchmark. And I don't think it was intended to be that when it first came up. But either way, there's little doubt that the Ref has had considerable impact on what's valued and thus what's supported in UK research. Also speaking of edited collections, participant 2 reflects on the experience of editing such a volume, calling it great, but, quote, in terms of refability, that doesn't really count. So basically years of really intensive work, I'm like, oh, that's not really what we want. And this is, in the ranking, that doesn't really count. And I'm thinking, but okay, this is the kind of thing that, edited collections, something that I use as a scholar, something that my students, I want them out there. If you don't value them, who's going to write them exactly? Who's going to edit them? In Ref terms, some types of output are perceived as more valuable than others, even within traditional written publications. I should note, though, that edited collections are a permitted output type for Ref, but again, there is a perception that they're less likely to score well than, say, a monograph. This is further true of other forms of outputs, such as practice-based research, which, although allowed, may be seen as risky, and difficult to assess by institutions compared to academic standards, such as journal articles. In sum, all these small considerations create a change in culture, and perhaps a less deep and diverse array of research, as observed by participant 21. It's been very gradual, but there's been a narrowing. Things like the ref, you feel the need to play it safe, which to some degree means you overproduce. You just go for something incremental on top of what you did the last time. You squeeze a paper out, you move on to the next one. One might argue that this is a positive effect, that work gets published, that researchers are motivated to produce in a timely manner, and this may be true in some cases. However, it shouldn't be overlooked that not all research is suited to the pace, schedule, or preferred output types understood to be demanded by the ref, and that there is also harm in pushing work to be published before it's ready, or in a manner that doesn't show it to its best advantage. Furthermore, the institutional concern with meeting certain metrics comes to dictate what draws focus, reducing support for activities that go unmeasured. Participant 25 continues, I think it puts pressure on to only do the things that have an influence on the metric. So TEF, for example, Teaching Excellence Framework. We do everything in our power to make sure the students are happy. Ref, for a lot of people, start doing research in areas that are refable for their institution or their department. So they won't do things that might be very valuable, but are not necessarily refable, because that's not where the funding is. It's not where institution support lies, because the institution needs to make sure they get a good ref outcome. So I do think it puts pressure on. And pressure's good in a way, but there are other things that don't get done anymore. Again, we see a hint as to one side of this argument, that pressure's good and manifestly turns results. But we also see the counterpoint, that the results are located in specific areas, that other valuable things don't get done because they're not where the funding is. It should be noted that although the ref creates anxiety, both collective and individual, about the quantity and quality of research produced, not to mention how it will be judged by colleagues and peers, it's also possible to be the beneficiary of ref strategies. Participant 22 observes that there are pervasive hiring biases that mean, quote, it's a well-known thing in academia that in terms of first jobs or early career researchers, the woman with more things published doesn't get the job because the young man looks like he has more promise. However, in terms of the ref, if you happen to be the person who does have the publications, that might just snag you the job. At crucial times in the ref cycle, a concrete achievement is worth more than an unfulfilled promise of something majestic. It can work to an individual's advantage, as it did to participant 22's, quote, that's what got me the job really, because I had a definite ref entry, whereas the other people who were much cleverer and, from better universities than me didn't have that. So I feel on the one hand, the ref is a sort of actual marker of what you've actually done. In an industry infected with hubris, reputation, the appearance of success, there is some value in measurement by markers of what a person has actually done, as compared to their aura of genius or prior affiliation to esteemed institutions or assumptions about their future greatness. However, what also gets lost in privileging the actually done over the potential to be done is investment in research and development, not for the plumped up intellectuals who trade off reputation, but for those who've not yet had an opportunity to prove themselves, who require institutional support and resource in order to make headway in their career, who've not been able to write a book in their spare time or cobble together enough work to subsidize their research activity. And that's a true loss and a major threat to equality and inclusion in academia. My personal view on research funding, grant bids and the ref combined, is that these two mechanisms are the most immediately responsible for heightened competitiveness in UKHE, and together have a negative impact on the sector. Having worked in both areas, I can't but see the administrative burden as a colossal waste of resource, and the harm done not just to people but to scholarship more widely is detrimental. There must be a better way that demands less duplication of effort and reduces collective panic. By way of illustrating potential alternatives, participants 5 and 6 both have some suggestions on this front. Participant 5 says, I think that really it would be better to identify what meets sort of a basic level of a good research design and ethics and compliance to various things, a kind of baseline, a good enough, and then just divide the money out equally or do it by lottery. And then I think we would have more interesting research, different ideas. I think we'd have more new things actually, and more new people. Participant 6 suggests, I'm in the research excellence framework. I'm not against people having to talk about those things, but clearly the whole point of it is to try and make sure that money for research only goes to some places and not others. So all these 130 universities, and they're all fighting, to be doing good research and to have that share of the pie that's too small for everybody to have a piece of. So I would like to see a planned attitude to higher education, where they said, well, as a society, how many universities do we want? How many students do we want to train? How much research do we want to do, and what kind? And then allocate it properly. So rather than making people waste energy fighting over things that they don't need to fight over. There would, of course, be pitfalls to these proposals, as there are to anything, but I include these ideas just as an illustration of different ways of thinking and a reminder that there are always alternatives. I'm also wary of giving too much weight to Participant 6's summary of the purpose of the REF, as I'm not sure perpetuating inequalities in funding allocations is the point, even if it is the consequence. This is inevitably always going to be an issue with giving the most resources to those who perform best, as it endows them with a further advantage. So, in summary, although many of the problems with the REF can be more accurately described as issues stemming from REF myths, there are nonetheless very real consequences from the reality of how REF is implemented that are worth keeping in mind as the next cycle gets underway. As with almost everything in an unequal society, the negative effects are felt differently and disproportionately across the sector. So there will undoubtedly be a variety of options about precisely how labour-intensive, anxiety-provoking, or problematic the REF is. Some of the main issues that I've touched on today have been that, firstly, the REF is institutionally burdensome in a variety of ways, and the different burdens fall unequally. The fact it's so overwhelming pulls focus from other activities and risks further devaluing those aspects of academic life that aren't measured. Perceptions about what kinds of research or topic will be scored highly by REF panelists can skew what type of work and what type of academic is institutionally supported. At the very least, the REF becomes a point of reference when designing projects and begins to act as a driver of behaviour rather than a benchmark, or at least something that lurks in the back of the mind. The fact that only 3-star and 4-star work attracts funding, in combination with only certain kinds of outputs being perceived to score this highly, risks research that's competent but not stellar, or research that may not translate well to the REF criteria, being dismissed as worthless and potentially discouraged. This may also result in academics being nudged out, not allowed in, or moved on to non-research contracts, which is a particular anxiety for those working in marginalised subjects and for part-time and early career scholars. In prioritising the concrete over the potential, at least at certain points, the focus can move towards hiring staff who are already a safe bet, rather than supporting those who may need more nurturing or more time. This potentially narrows the field to swifter areas of research and those who are in a position to produce research outputs without the need for external resource, whether that be time, money, facilities, mentorship, or etc. The link between winning grants and the ability to produce refable research further increases the pressure on staff to bring in funding so that they have projects to deliver outputs from. Competitiveness in academia more generally is heightened by these twin activities, creating potential for division, individualism, and the further marginalisation of those who already suffer from inequalities in how funding is distributed. Finally, putting aside for a moment the issues related to the practicalities of navigating the REF submission process, there's the broader question of whether, why, and how research assessment is conducted in the first place. On the matter of whether, I think it's fair to say that some sort of quality control and accountability should be in operation, as we would expect for any use of public money. However, given that much research submitted to the REF will be the product of grant-funded projects, which already have review and reporting built into them, and as much of it will have been published via peer-reviewed channels, it can certainly be argued that a further layer of post-hoc assessment, especially as it contains very little feedback and therefore leaves institutions in the dark about how to improve, is over-egging the pudding somewhat. As for why research might be assessed, Well, this relates to the first point, in that as for why research might be assessed, well, this relates to the first point, in that if such a large operation is to be staged, it could be done in a manner that's more constructive for universities and thus feels like less of a test. I would also strongly advocate for the results to be untethered from funding so that patterns of achievement and reward do not simply re-entrench. And that brings us to how research is assessed and by what measures, which is probably the weightiest question of all and nicely circles back to the impetus for this project in the first place. Throughout all of academia, but most visibly perhaps in the ref, the ultimate aim of scholarly endeavour is to critique, categorise, rank, judge. But whose values are these by which we assess so-called quality? What is excellence? How else might we choose to look for, celebrate and value? What else might we choose to look for, celebrate and value, if not preoccupied with the hegemonic tyranny of the established criteria and the doomed attempt to objectively apply them? I'll finish on a lengthy quote from participant 5 because they nicely encapsulate these questions, pointing to the deterministic and self-perpetuating nature of excellence and success. Before I do, however, I want to be clear that while I am largely cynical about the ref and have deep reservations about the standards by which research is assessed, there's a colossal amount of work that goes into both the research submitted and the process of compiling a ref submission. Having overseen one myself, I can't help but be enormously proud of the outcome, even though I'm also suspicious of the measures of assessment. And I think it's possible to hold these two things in mind simultaneously without being accused of hypocriteness. If we have to engage with burdensome and less than ideal activities, even or perhaps especially if we oppose them on some level, this shouldn't rob us of the opportunity to celebrate at the very least having jumped through the hoops. Everything about the ref is imperfect, but nonetheless, the release of the results represents a culmination of 7 to 8 years of collective endeavour that is worth pausing to acknowledge for a moment before being thrust headlong into considerations of Ref 2028. But to close, here's participant 5. It sounds like a really sensible thing to do, right? You decide what research is excellent, and then you give money to the people who are doing excellent things, because that would be correct, right? So you've got a limited pot, you should give it to people who do excellent research. Well, this is fine, except that, well, actually it's not fine. But anyway, even if we thought it was fine, it's not really possible to objectively define excellence. This is a subjective judgment, and it tends to entrench the existing order, which you might cynically say it was supposed to do. But I also just have a general kind of concern about the idea of excellence. What about difference? What about things that are just different, or things you hadn't thought about before, or funny, slightly flaky ideas that maybe were proposed by someone who hasn't quite got their head around the research design? But actually, that's kind of interesting, and we should maybe follow it up. Those sorts of things, stuff that just kind of bubbles up because it hasn't had a chance to kind of be polished up, or, they haven't had a chance to become excellent yet, perhaps for one reason or another. But maybe they've got some interesting things to say or something different to think about. What is excellence? And even if we could really identify excellence, is that the only thing we need? Don't we also need to just hear different voices and explore new themes? I'm not sure about excellence because I think it might be meaningless ultimately. And that if you pick something to investigate and spend enough time on it, enough resources, you could make it excellent, whatever that might mean. So you decide what's excellent by giving people the money to pursue it, sort of, and that makes it excellent. And now for some calming manatees. Thank you for listening.
Jess, thank you so much. I mean, I would maybe have said that was excellent, but after that last quote, I've decided not to. But no, it was absolutely fascinating. I mean, what a clear, really interesting and incredibly nuanced presentation you gave there. I think, the way that you did that really nuanced analysis and discussed not only what the ref possibly intends to do, but the actual effect was fantastic. And you're bringing in your discussion about it. I think what people often don't do is then end with kind of different possibilities or how you might see it otherwise, which you did really well. And the questions about what is valued in it. So thank you so much. The manatees are fantastic. but maybe if you stop sharing now, and then we can see who is here as well. If people want to turn their cameras on now, you're very welcome to do that, and then there's a sense in which we can all engage in the discussion. If you don't feel comfortable putting your camera on, then that's absolutely fine too. But if you do feel able to, that would be great. So there's now plenty of time for questions, and I see that there's already a question in the chat. So there are different options. I mean, I can read out some of the questions that are in the chat if people would prefer that. But if people are happy to ask them, I think that's also helpful too. So there's a question that was posed by Sharon. And I don't know, Sharon, whether you'd like to pose that question yourself rather than me read it out.
I'm happy to try, Carolyn. I'm just recovering from COVID and my voice hasn't quite come back yet. So I apologize if I'm a bit hoarse. Thank you so much for that presentation, Jess. I'm South African, as you might be able to hear from my accent, and I started working in UK higher education last year in September. And so I really identify with some of these anxieties about having referable research, because I work in a post-92 university, and the unit that I would be part of was not submitted in 2014 because they didn't do well in the previous exercise. There's a whole thing around it. And so now every time I have a meeting with my line manager, she says, have you put anything in for the ref? And I'm like, no, not yet. And maybe this sort of leads into my question, is this idea of I'm doing work that requires time. It's new research. I need time to think. I need time to read. I don't want to just sort of churn out meaningless papers. I want this research to actually say something. So I'm definitely caught in that whole, I have to get publications out, but I also need to push back against that and just kind of go like, could I just have a few minutes to just think about this, please? So I'm wondering about this idea of risk, because you mentioned risk, and I think we all know, working in universities anywhere in the world, that these institutions are immensely risk averse and becoming maybe increasingly risk averse. And I'm thinking more of how this translates then also into how we recruit PhD students, because I'm quite interested in doctoral students and early career from that perspective. And so this idea, and you definitely sort of illustrate this, if we're increasingly risk averse, and the way we then apportion funding and decide who's excellent really tends to privilege people who are already pretty privileged in various ways, and who are already probably quite productive in the ways that are rewarded. Are we, obviously then we're excluding certain kinds of research, but we're also excluding particular researchers who have not yet been able, as you say at the end, to become excellent for a range of reasons. So can we mitigate this? Can we push back against this? Is that just a completely futile exercise? And then also, if we are going to be saying, can we have different understandings of what excellence is, and can we make space for different bodies and different ideas and different ways of doing research? Who should be doing this? Because often I think the burden of pushing back gets put onto people who are currently being made to feel that they don't belong. And why should those people be doing the work? But the more powerful people don't necessarily seem to be doing it either. So it's partially formed. I'm sorry, it's not very articulate, but that was my question.
Thank you. Thanks very much. There's a lot to unpack and respond to there. I think the who question is always a really difficult one, because in some ways, the people who are the most privileged and who feel that they belong the most or are seen to belong the most, can't be aware of all of the issues. So to some degree, the people who are experiencing the issues have to be the ones to raise them. But then it's like, do we have powerful allies, basically? Are those people then going to push that up? Or are they basically just going to go, oh, that's nice, thanks for telling me? And then it kind of gets kicked into the long grass, which, I think can happen. And the ref is quite a big driver of that kind of thing, because it just dominates so much attention at particular times that really no one has any room in their brain to think or frankly care about quite a lot of other really pressing issues. And I think that is one of my biggest problems with the ref, really, is because it's so kind of lopsided. It has this very long cycle, and then for 2 years maybe it really dominates kind of everything, and then falls away for a bit and then comes back. And so there are all these inequalities, which sort of in a way relates to your question about PhD students in when people are entering the profession and what's happening at that moment that they're there. And the risk aversion is so much more, like close to a ref census date, for example, than right now when everyone's probably willing to be a bit, there's more time for things to happen. And I don't really know how we push, or even if we can push back against that. The only thing I can really say is that the people who participated in my research who felt, I think, the most happy and content with their academic lives were those who had somehow managed to get a balance where they did enough of the kind of research that was going to satisfy, the institution and the ref. And maybe it wasn't like their proudest achievement and the work they really wanted to stand behind, but they knew that if they kicked out a couple of solid publications, then that would kind of, get the wolf from the door, and it would liberate time and energy for them to then be able to like focus on some of their more kind of out there stuff, or the stuff that isn't as institutionally valued. And obviously it takes a certain position to be able to do that. And it takes a certain amount, I would, it's difficult if you're early career and you don't have that many publications to choose from, and the whole process is more laborious. But yeah, that's the only kind of practical thing I can say, is that somehow just trying to, pay your tithe to the system and then use that as a way of carving out some more space for your own priorities.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jess, and thanks for your questions, Sharon. Marco.
Hi, trying to lower my hand. Thank you very much for this excellent presentation. I'm a visiting researcher at Lancaster University, but from Germany, and we have a similar kind of initiative called the Excellence Initiative, which is also very criticized, and it reminded me of this. It was a fascinating presentation. Continuing what Sharon Clarence said before, I was wondering if you can tell something about this. Maybe I missed it, then I'm absolutely sorry, between the interplay between what the agenda or requirements of the ref are in relation to these personal qualities and circumstances. Because I was wondering, as it was mentioned before, whose research is published, whose research is shared, who is able to succeed in this kind of environment. And it might vary differently for people from different ethnic backgrounds, people from lower social classes, people with disabilities, female scholars, people who have care responsibilities, taking care of family members. It might be very different in terms of time management. As it was said before, it takes time to do research, it takes time to publish it. And if you have to manage a life along the way, it might be particularly difficult. And I was wondering if this has emerged more deeply in the interviews between, personal circumstances or qualities and the ref requirements.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that. I mean, it's a really significant point, and actually that kind of gets to the heart of the whole research project. Is even putting aside just the ref requirements, but the requirements of the proper academic are such that it's very exclusionary to people who aren't able to meet them. And I think in the section where I just briefly mentioned this kind of imperative to overwork, to work excessive numbers of hours, whether that's to look like someone who's working excessive number of hours, just so people go, oh, you really are an academic, you couldn't possibly ever put down your book or your computer or your pen, or whether it's to get all of those research outputs that are required for the ref. It's just, it's an imperative that a lot of people are really unable to meet. And there's also the question of whether we should want to be able to work in that way. But it is definitely an enormous barrier to anyone who has other responsibilities and demands on their time. And in this way, it really does replicate existing kind of inequalities and patterns of privilege. In terms of the ref, there are mechanisms by which the number of outputs needed in the overall submission and even the minimum of one output attributed to each individual member of staff returned you can apply to ref and ask for a reduction in that based on a plethora of personal circumstances, from being part-time to caring responsibilities to ill health, maternity or paternity, and being early career. But the thing is the guidance doesn't get published until kind of, halfway through the cycle, and then it changes a bit, and then you have to apply, and you don't know whether or not you're going to get those reductions approved. And by the time you do know that, you kind of need people to have already published the stuff if they're going to not approve that. So it's just risky. It's like that whole risk aversion thing again, of even if people within the institution know that they can do that, they would probably just rather keep it simple and be like, oh, well, these people have got publications and we know they're a safe bet. So I think overall, it still just reduces the appetite to really kind of broaden things.
Thank you very much.
Thanks. Corinna, you put a comment in the chat about the where work published by PhD students are attributed to. Do you want to comment on that, or are you happy with just that comment being in there? Okay, I'll assume we'll just take that as a comment in the chat then. Sunita, you've put a question in there. Do you want to just speak that, or do you want me to read that out?
Well, I could just read it out, but it was essentially, I guess, in a sense, asking whether we recognize that these concerns have been raised again and again about the contradictions, the uncertainties, the problems that are there with the ref. But have you seen examples in other departments, universities, not necessarily, where people have collectively pushed back and been able to have some success in doing so? That's one question. And of course, the other is that this is so much about privilege, that the people who are getting cited, who are having those journals, are often a particular class of people, a particular, racial category often. And for anybody else to get into that system is very hard if they are not producing that level of publications that are considered 2-star and above. So there's certainly an element of race that is associated with the exclusion and the awarding of excellence to an already privileged category. So very much, I guess in a sense, building on what Sharon has said. So I'd love to hear your thoughts. And it was a great presentation. Thanks so much, Jessica, for so clear and passionate. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I mean, I can only really draw on my own experience of having worked on the ref, but it's kind of interesting having done it at like a small specialist institution where it was just only submitting to one unit of assessment, and then having worked on a unit of assessment within a large Russell Group institution. And I think one of the problems there with pushing back is that the people, it's directors of research, heads of department, are often the people who are kind of responsible at their local level for making sure that the department falls into line in terms of gathering all of the ref stuff and doing all of the things. And, then it gets passed on to the faculty dean or whoever. And there are all these, in large institutions, just so many chains of command. It's like would be impossible even to like identify who the top person is. But everyone in that chain has like a vested interest for their own career in ensuring that they are seen to kind of do well. And I've definitely worked with some people who's just, their anxiety just bleeds out of them really about their own wish and their need and their responsibility to kind of perform their compliance and to deliver a good result to their managers and on behalf of the institution. That means I think that, sometimes those people can occupy an interesting role in that you would hope that they would be representing the wishes and the needs of their department, and that if people are trying to push back, they will push too. But actually, I found, as someone who did try and push back on certain things, quite a lot of resistance, even in the immediate levels above me, to appearing to be difficult, appearing to be disruptive. And I think that kind of goes all the way down the chain. And we can probably all identify with that feeling of like, oh, do I want to be the person who sticks my neck out? Do I want to be the person who questions my superiors? And that can be a real barrier to pushing back. So I haven't really seen much collective pushing back. And I also think people feel very conflicted, because there's this kind of desire to do well. Everyone has the desire to do well on some level. I think even when people feel like work going into peer review or whatever is a cynical exercise. But there's on some level always that like, oh, but maybe someone will rank me 4-star. Like maybe I'll have the 4-star research. Maybe I'll be told that it's good. And there's a lot of conflict, I think, in knowing exactly what to push back against as well, because there are so many myths in place and so many misunderstandings of the guidance, misreadings of the guidance, misapplications of the rules, that it all becomes very confusing and kind of more confusing as time goes on and new guidance is published. And it's a minefield. And I don't think that was a very good answer to your question, I'm afraid. But yeah, I've seen precious little really with anyone wanting to question the ref at any kind of senior level.
I think that was a great answer, Jess. Kelly, you've made a really interesting point in the chat. I don't know whether you would be happy to voice that.
Sure, yeah. So yeah, I'm really interested in the ref in terms of how it impacts sort of staff recruitment strategies. That's something I've looked in. So I'm on the DEPA programme, and for one of my part 1 core modules, I looked at how the ref has influenced staff recruitment strategies in sort of sport and allied health professions, because like I say in that comment, it's quite interesting that a lot of those vocational kind of professions where industry experience is very valued within industry, when it comes into moving into academia, that then kind of gets missed slightly in terms of, I think probably due to this, the importance now of the ref. We've, for example, in where I work, you have to have ref 4-star submissions to even be considered for interview. And then that obviously poses quite some issues, in kind of professions where industry experience is not only valued in that sense, but probably necessary. There's people getting employed that have no industry experience, but have refable papers, and therefore they're employed over the people that have had 20 years experience in industry as such. So yeah, that's not really a question as such, but it's just more of a thought.
Thank you, Kelly. Do you want to respond, Jess? Or
I guess I'll just briefly say that that's a very interesting point. More generally, it's something that did come up in the research a couple of times with participants who worked in departments where they needed industry professionals, and how this created a kind of lopsided dynamic as well. So they're kind of pure straight through academics, as they were described, were leaned on very heavily to produce the bulk of the kind of refable outputs that they'd need in order to get people from industry. It was going to be hard to persuade them that they were going to need to come in and spend all of this additional time doing their research, because they can get paid so much more to just do their job where they're doing their job. So it's really interesting to hear about that other kind of side to it, and how in some places that's making it more difficult for industry-based practitioners to get roles. And I wonder if this will become more of a kind of, there'll be an attempt to really reinforce this thing about, having some people on teaching only contracts and some people on research contracts, so that you can get that experience that you need for the teaching side, but not necessarily be so concerned about whether or not they're going to have the time or whatever to kind of get those excellent outputs in for you.
thanks. Please keep the questions coming. There's still plenty of time. Just while we're waiting for any more questions, I wondered whether, I love the way you do the analysis of belonging and unbelonging, and I think the notion of unbelonging is one that many of us will relate to. I certainly can. But did any of your participants actually really feel a sense of belonging?
Not in any kind of consistent way that I could identify. It wasn't meant to be a project about belonging, so it's not something that I actually asked anybody about. It's just this theme that kind of came up actually when I was writing a chapter about imposter syndrome, and I thought I'd talk about that, and then decided that wasn't really a very useful lens to look through, and just realized that actually the thing that kind of held together all of these accounts was this sense of being out of place, like there, but sort of not quite there at the same time. But how this isn't, it's not constant, because it depends what room you're in. It depends what context you're in. It depends who else is around you and whether you're valued in that space and whether you see other people like you in that space. So for sure, there were reports of times and situations and places and company in which people did feel very connected to others, but it was just so kind of intangible, hard to grasp, and that could change depending just on which building you were walking through. As one participant talked about, how like one discipline is very female and one discipline is very male. So depending, you walk through the science building and you just see a different set of people and feel a different way in relation to those people when you get there. So I think that's why I like the kind of unbelonging thing, is it's not really meant to be the opposite of belonging or to say, this is exclusion. It means that you're totally on the outside, but really it's about this sense, this kind of internal feeling of just slightly not feeling right, not feeling whole, not feeling held, not feeling a complete part of the environment. And it's really interesting to trace how that happens and why that happens and when that happens, and to notice that it really is a thing that, everyone experiences at different times. But obviously some people experience it in like 50 ways almost all of the time, and some people experience it every now and again. But I think what's also interesting about it is that people relate to that much more than they relate to when they feel good or when they feel at home. It's like that tends to be the thing that people talk about, and people tend to focus on what they're missing and what they're lacking and what they want more of, and all of their deficits and all of their failures and all of that, all of that. The attention really becomes hyper focused on that. And there's just less talk about all of the good bits and all of the kind of the ease or the positive sides.
Yeah, thank you. Mark, I note you've put a comment in. Do you want to verbalize that?
Well, I didn't want to capture the stage any longer than I already did, but it came to my mind, because Jessica or Jess beautifully said it before, that when we talk about what is excellent or what is quality in research, what are excellent publications, we usually have only a certain moment or certain grasp of a picture. It's never the whole picture. It's those scholars who have the possibility or the chance to get the research published, fast enough in high-ranked papers, who hugely benefit from a system that favors certain characteristics and certain types of academics, usually the old white man's club. And this is, when we talk about excellence and quality, we, and it's also what other people said, have to consider that there are scholars whose voices are never heard, who's doing excellent work or doing great work, but they're being oppressed or not favored by the whole research, publishing, performance, productivity kind of academic system. And when we talk about quality and excellence, we have to consider how we can make those people heard, how we can access their research, or how we can offer them the stage or the platform to contribute to this whole discussion. That just came to my mind, sorry.
Yes, I agree.
Great, thanks. Jane, you've put an interesting comment in the chat. Do you want to say anything about that?
Yes, I'm happy to. Just that it really strikes me thinking of, it is just about my own experience, but how I've been in the social work teaching team here at Lancaster. It's a lovely team, really nice place to work, very supportive, but there is this definite kind of arrangement of people being on different contracts because of their different experiences, and that's fine, and we make that work. But it is interesting that in going back to I think the point colleague made earlier about those kind of industry representations and how important they can be within some kinds of teaching. So you can't run a social work program without registered social workers, but it's very difficult to be a social worker and be a kind of top ranking researcher. So there has to be other ways that those people can find their way into HEI. So I suppose we've done quite a bit of thinking recently about these different types of contracts which are now available at Lancaster, and I'm being honest, I don't think we're all that sure what they mean, but we are hoping to kind of play about with them and see where they lead.
Thanks, Jane. Do you want to say anything about that, Jess? Or
yeah, I mean, I think the kind of the broader array of kind of academic contracts that are springing up now, I think, is largely a response to the requirements of the ref, you know, where it's the eligible staff is very much based on those contractual definitions about who has significant responsibility for research, who's an independent researcher, you know, how people's relationship to the institution is defined and what the expectation on them is. Now that the ref isn't a selective exercise anymore, where institutions just go, oh, we'll submit these people and we'll ignore those people. And that's going to have all kinds of interesting effects, I think, as it becomes more of a kind of mainstream thing. And, you know, reports are kind of different as well. I know if even in just sort of more sort of straightforward academic departments where some people can be on a teaching fellow contract rather than a, you know, a kind of lecturer contract. But some people like that because they get a little bit of time to do research, but don't have the pressure to produce this stuff, you know, there constantly in the background. But at the same time, very much a sense, at least that came through in my research, that these are kind of second order roles, you know, in terms of the kind of perceptions of what an academic is, and that it's really, you know, just a teacher. There are lots of kinds of, the hierarchy then kind of just becomes a bit more stratified, I suppose. But it will be interesting if there are more kind of permutations of that, whether this comes to do something different. And especially, you know, it would just be really nice to see other academic forms of labour elevated to the level that research has. But unfortunately, I think until there's something as important as the ref that focuses on something else, it's quite unlikely that that's going to happen.
thanks. And any more questions or comments or? Okay, if not, then I'll thank Jess again for what has been a really excellent presentation and discussion. And thank you all for being here and for such stimulating questions and discussion. And yeah, lots of applause there. And there's lots of comments in the chat, Jess, about how interesting it was and how engaging your presentation was. So thank you. Before we finish, I'll just say that the next online EdRes seminar is on the 15th of June. And that will be presented by Dr. Mark Carrigan, who works at the Institute of Education at the University of Manchester. And the title is Digital Scholarship After COVID-19. So that's the 15th of June, same time, same place. But Jess, thank you so much. And again, thank you to everybody for being here. And we look forward. I mean, we should also say that you have already published from your PhD. Do you want to say where people can find your work if they're interested in reading it now?
If I'm not sure if the slides have been circulated or dropped into the chat, I can probably upload them somewhere. There are some references to some like further reading at the end, both by me and by some other people on the ref. So yeah, I can distribute those, or just Google me and you'll find things. Thank you.
But yeah, well worth reading, and look forward to reading more. So thank you, everybody, and see you all again soon, I hope.
Thank you very much, everyone.